one. Okay. Here we are. Crack the window. Blinds. Should improve the green screen. Maybe not. Try selecting a different hue. Go. This one. Ooh, yeah, there we go. Okay. So, I've added ideas to the borders of the window here. And, oh no, what happened? Just gonna increase the similarity massively. Video is not a big deal on this. Okay. So I've added the ideas to the sides of the screen here. I think as I read the introductions to them in the Syntopicon, I'll use this strike through text decoration to cross them out one at a time. And then I can sort of just pick, look at the list and pick ones that I want to read about. Like maybe I'll start with good and evil. That sounds interesting. Or maybe I'll start with wisdom, or virtue and vice, or what else? Mind, or God. He actually wrote a whole book called How to Think About God. So I'd imagine that that's probably a pretty good introduction. But first, I want to read the section titled The Introductions, or part 3 of the whole freaking book they wrote on how they appendix 2 of volume 2 of the Syntopicon, Principles and Methods of Syntopical Construction. It's 5 parts. the great ideas inventory of terms, the outlines of topics and the cross-references, the introductions, the references, and the additional readings. And since I'll be reading the introductions, and I don't want to, I'm not too interested on how they created the Syntopicon at the moment. I'm just going to read part 3, which is only like 8 pages or something. And then maybe I'll read one of the introductions to the great ideas if it's not too long. My coffee. Pretty excited because I found the entire collection. I guess a 1952 printing, but not the same one. Not these leather-bound ones. Not this set. This might be like, I don't know, maybe this one or the one I bought is the Founders Edition. But I was able to find the whole set for $125 with $4 shipping from halfpricebooks.com. Amazingly. So I'll be surprised if I even get it, to be honest, because that's like a super discounted price and like no shipping cost, even though it's 54 volumes of books. Pretty good deal. I don't just have to find a place to put them on my bookshelves. Maybe I can get the, I think that IKEA sells like an extension for the top of these bookshelves. You can make them taller. That would be cool. Then I would have to have like a step stool to get to the top. I'd look into that. Take advantage of my ceiling space. Part 3, the introductions. In the structure of each chapter, the outline of topics follows the introduction. This essay might have been expected, therefore, to deal with the introductions before it discussed the outline of topics. There are 2 reasons for reversing the expected order. First, the topics are, in a sense, integral parts of the great ideas, and therefore the examination of the outlines as analyses of the ideas naturally follows the consideration of the ideas themselves. Second, the topics state the themes, problems, and issues with which the introductions deal. The introduction to each of the great ideas is, in part at least, a commentary on its topics. It is not out of order, therefore, to examine the commentary after considering the topics commented on. But if this is the proper order, then it would seem that it might have been better in constructing the Syntopicon to have placed the outline of topics first in each chapter, with the introduction following rather than preceding it. But the fact is that the introductions are only in part a commentary on the topics. They also deal with the idea as a whole in such a way as to be preparatory for reading the topics. They are genuinely introductions to the topics as well as commentaries on them. The reciprocal illumination of each by the other will be better understood in terms of the purposes the introductions are intended to serve. It will then become clear that the advantage of reading the outlines of topics before the introductions is almost equal to the advantage of reading the introductions first. Like the outlines of topics, the introductions vary from chapter to chapter, not so much in length as in their method of exposition. They do not all begin or end the same way, nor do they uniformly treat the same matters or proceed in the same order. The way in which each introduction deals with a great idea corresponds to the characteristic difference of that idea from all the others. The ideas differ in 4 respects, and the introductions differ accordingly. Each idea has a unique structure. It also has a unique history. The character and intensity of its verbal difficulties are often peculiar to itself. The problems and issues it has engendered are different in origin and in the possibilities of their resolution. Nevertheless, all the introductions were conceived and written to perform a common task. They were intended to serve the same fourfold purpose, corresponding to the 4 respects in which the ideas differ. The introductions attempt to treat each idea semantically, historically, analytically, and dialectically. First, the semantic aim. It has already been pointed out that most of the names of the great ideas have a range of meanings. They have been used by the authors of the great books in different senses, and many of them have, in addition, meanings of recent origin or popularity. This is true not only of the principal term in each chapter, but also of some of the subordinate terms which appear in the topics. Often, the meaning of the principal term is affected by the meaning of a subordinate term connected with it in the statement of a topic. The semantic aim of the introductions is to record the various meanings of the words which have been used to name the great ideas, and of the other words which have been used traditionally and currently in discussing the great ideas. The introductions seldom try to do this exhaustively. They aim at verbal clarification only where necessary in order to prevent real agreements from being obscured by differences in language, or to discover real disagreements in thought between men who, as far as their language goes, appear to be saying the same, or at least compatible things. Like the other parts of the Syntopicon, the introductions have as their ultimate aim the reenactment of the great conversation. Each introduction tries to recreate the discussion of a great idea as though the authors contributing to that discussion were engaged in conversation about its major topics, and almost as though they were contemporaries. confronting each other in actual discourse rather than dispersed across 30 centuries. The semantic aim of the introductions is to clarify the meanings of the words they use so that they can be heard talking relevantly to one another. The introductions succeed to the extent that they suggest how the great minds of the Western tradition exist together in a single universe of discourse. That's cool. 2. The historical aim. To collapse 30 centuries of imagination and thought into a single historical moment would seem to be unhistorical, or worse, anti-historical. Yet the introductions have just been described as doing exactly this, since they treat the authors of the great books as if they were contemporaries and use the present sense in reporting their discussion of ideas. Mill and Aristotle, for example, may be reported as taking one side of an issue on which they are opposed by Plato and Hobbes. Lucretius may be said to be more in agreement with Freud on certain matters than he is with anyone in antiquity. As far as possible, the authors are associated with one another in terms of their thought, not their times. They are opposed to one another in the same way. The centuries can be as readily bridged by genuine agreements as they can be divided by disagreements, apparent or genuine. Neither the agreement nor the disagreement is a necessary function of simultaneity or succession in time. Yet, sometimes a certain point of view is characteristic of a period or phase of Western civilization. Sometimes the political, economic, and cultural conditions of a time are more than the background of thinking or the environment to which the thought refers. They are conditions of the thought itself, and therefore of its intelligibility. It is unquestionable that some men originate ideas which others borrow and often change. There is little doubt that the thought of one whole period influences the thought of a later period, either to react against it or to alter it for assimilation. Certainly, then, the succession of the centuries, the location of minds in time, the relation of thought and imagery to the culture of a period, the influence of one mind upon another and one period upon another, certainly all these things are significant features of the great conversation as it develops in time. The very word tradition connotes a passing from age to age, both a heritage and an inheritance. To consider the tradition of Western thought is, therefore, to deal with the history of ideas. Both sides of the picture contain a portion of the truth, the temporal and non-temporal, and historical and unhistorical. Thought transcends time to a certain extent, and to a certain extent, time conditions thought. Ideas have a career in time and therefore a history, but they also have an inner logic which transcends history. To some extent, therefore, all minds dealing with the same ideas are contemporary. They are together in the same logical, if not historical, moment by virtue of their agreements and disagreements. To deny this is to commit the error of historicism. But in some measure, minds dealing with the same ideas cannot deal with them in the same way at different historical moments. To neglect or ignore this fact is to commit an opposite error, which might be labeled transcendentalism. Okay. The introductions try to avoid the fallacies of both extremes by combining the historical with the logical treatment of ideas, but they do not try to do equal justice to both aspects of the matter, and in consequence do not preserve a perfect balance between the two approaches. The primary aim of the introductions is not historical, as it is not semantic. It is dialectical. The introductions do not carry verbal clarification further than is necessary to prevent language from obscuring the logical realities, the issues, the agreements, the disagreements, and the arguments. For the same reason, the introductions do not engage in the history of ideas for its own sake. They remain unhistorical wherever possible and become historical only to indicate places where the history of ideas is itself part of the dialectic of ideas. Not all of the great ideas are involved in an historical dialectic to the same extent. At one extreme, with ideas like beauty, chance, courage, definition, education, emotion, happiness, infinity, justice, knowledge, love, nature, opinion, pleasure and pain, punishment, sense, and tyranny. The discussion seems to be comparatively unaffected by the historical location of the minds engaged in it. It completes almost the same circle of logical development in every period. The focus does not change from time to time. The discussion as a whole does not move irreversibly along the line of history. The introductions to such chapters, therefore, can be largely unhistorical in their dialectical effort to state the main features of the discussion. At the other extreme, with such ideas as angel, astronomy, constitution, democracy, element, evolution, family, God, immortality, labor, logic, mathematics, mechanics, philosophy, progress, prophecy, religion, sin, theology, war and peace, and wealth, the discussion seems to be seriously affected by intellectual and cultural differences between different epochs. The whole conversation shifts its ground and changes its focus as it passes in the spheres of politics, economics, and the sciences from ancient to modern times, and in the spheres of religion and theology from pagan antiquity to the Christian Middle Ages or the medieval Christendom to the increasingly secular culture of the modern epoch. Its starting points are not the same, and its logical development takes different directions as the whole discussion develops historically. Hence, the introductions to such chapters must be historical in treating the pivotal points of the dialectic. To the extent to which the introductions treat the great ideas historically, they trace their development in a number of ways. trace their development in a number of ways. They may call attention on the semantic side to changes in the meaning of the basic words from period to period. On the analytical side, they frequently note which parts of the idea, which of its topics or themes, occupied by the center of discussion at one time, but received little or no attention at another. Above all, in relation to the dialectic of the discussion, they try to suggest the actual course of the great conversation by observing its continuities and discontinuities, especially the latter. They throw historical light on the failures of the dialectic, the failure of minds to meet or join issue, or as between the thought of one period and that of another, the weakening of relevance to the breaking point. If, on the whole, the introductions lean more to the dialectic than to the history of the great ideas, the balance is somewhat restored by the fact that under each topic, the references to the great books are arranged in historical order. The reader who follows the discussion by reading the books or passages in the order in which they are cited will be able to discover for himself many historical collocations and sequences which the introductions fail to note, where they are only suggested or briefly touched on in the introductions. They are amply documented in the references. Yet, even here, the complementary point remains to be made. Under each topic, the references are set forth in historical order, but the books and passages cited under one topic would not be there unless they all satisfied the requirement of relevance. They can be relevant to one another only if they are talking about the same thing. Such relevance signifies that all the authors belong to the same tradition, or, in other words, they all participate in the same culture or civilization, no matter how it may be subdivided into epochs or phases. From the point of view of world culture, which must remain unformed so long as the world remains divided into a number of distinct cultures, what we call the culture of the West is unitary, in spite of all the separate strands or segments we can find in it. From the point of view of world history, which in a strict sense cannot begin until a world culture is formed, the 30 centuries of imagination and thought represented in the great books tend to become a single time, even as the books tend to belong to a single tradition and culture. By taking the point of view of future world history, we can imagine how the whole tradition of Western culture may someday appear as a single parochial episode. In a sense, the introductions are making this imaginary construction when they present the great conversation in the present tense as if it were taking place among contemporaries. So that was the part. So we had one, the semantic aim. 2, the historical aim. 3, the analytical aim. And now we have 4, the oh wait, that was 2. Now we have 3, the analytical aim. The outlines of topics present analysis of the great ideas. The introductions perform an analytical function in commenting on the structure of the ideas as set forth in the outlines. The outlines do not explain themselves, for the most part. The order and subordination of the topics do not need explanation. But occasionally, the reason for including or giving special prominence to a certain topic or group of topics may not be immediately obvious, especially if the matters dealt with are not familiar to contemporary thought. The converse is also true. Occasionally, the absence of topics which are currently subjects of great interest may deserve a word of explanation. The introductions try to throw light on both these aspects of the outlines. I didn't read this, did I? No, I don't think so. The major parts of the discussion of a great idea are the fundamental problems and issues in which that idea is involved. In commenting on these, the introductions usually adopt the topical statement of them in the outlines. Though there is seldom a perfect correspondence between the content of the introductions and that of the outlines, there is a general conformity between the main points treated in each. Their order is not necessarily the same, for a discursive treatment of related problems and issues usually demands an order markedly different from that suitable to a topical outline. In many chapters, topics will be found in the outline which are not considered in the introduction. There are 2 reasons for this. First, the outlines of topics for a particular idea usually raises more points of importance or interest than can be treated in a short essay. Therefore, some must be ignored or mentioned only in passing. Second, the outline in a particular chapter frequently includes topics which are similar to or identical with topics in other chapters. Hence, to avoid repetition and undue length, the introduction to a particular chapter may leave to another chapter's introduction the treatment of a subject common to both. Wherever possible, the introductions notify the reader that a given topic receives where was I? Wherever possible, the introductions notify the reader that a given topic receives attention or ampler treatment in the introductions to other chapters, just as the cross-references for a given chapter indicate the relation of its topics to those of other chapters. So the introduction supplies its own cross-references to other introductions in which related matters are discussed. In doing this, the introductions not only indicate, but often try to illuminate the interconnection of the great ideas. In addition to examining the structure of the idea with which it deals, it is part of the analytical aim of each introduction to place the idea in the larger structure of the whole set of ideas, and especially in the constellation of closely related ideas to which it belongs. In performing their function as commentaries on the outlines of topics, the introductions usually pay special attention to the groups of doctrinal topics which set forth the positions or views of different authors in their own language. The fact that doctrinal topics could not be avoided in the outline for a particular chapter indicates both semantic and analytical difficulties, which the mere statement of doctrinal topics seldom solves completely. Whenever possible, the introductions attempt to deal with these difficulties discursively and to clarify points that the elliptical statement of the topics necessarily leaves obscure. But the groups of doctrinal topics call for more than clarification. They usually represent a profound difference of opinion or a many-sided controversy to the tradition of the great books. In treating such matters, the introductions go beyond their semantic and analytical functions on the dialectical, which is their primary aim. I don't even know what dialectical means. Dialect? Isn't that like language? You always hear the phrase local dialect. Communication. 4. The dialectical aim. The introductions attempt to report some of the major issues or basic intellectual oppositions in the sphere of each of the great ideas. That this is their primary aim does not imply that disagreement is the dominant feature of the intellectual tradition. On the contrary, agreement is, in almost every case, accompanies disagreement. That is, on most of the great issues, the opinions or views which represent opposite sides of the dispute are shared by several authors, often by many. Seldom do we find a solitary exponent of a controversial position. The great issues align men side by side as well as range them against one another. If in the rare case disagreement does not carry with it a proportionate amount of agreement, that disproportion is balanced by the fact that on a small number of fundamental questions, there seems to be no disagreement among the authors of the great books. On the whole, there is as much agreement as disagreement in the tradition of Western thought. Agreement across the centuries as well as among contemporaries, and disagreement likewise. The primacy of the dialectical aim of the introductions follows from the primacy of the mind's concern with truth. The other aims represent preparatory considerations. how language has been used to express thought, how thought has been affected by historic circumstances, the ground thought has covered in dealing with the great ideas. All these preparations lead to the question they leave unanswered. Where does the truth lie in all the thinking that has been done on each of the great ideas? Where is thought true and where is it false? The dialectical aim of the introductions is primary because it is motivated by this fundamental consideration. In their concern with agreements and disagreements, the introductions approach the question of truth and falsity, the agreement of men about the nature of things in any field of inquiry establishes some presumption of the truth of the opinions they commonly hold. Their disagreement establishes the counter-presumption that none of the opinions in conflict, whether shared or not, may be wholly true. Among conflicting opinions, one may, of course, be wholly true and all the rest false. But it is also possible that each express some portion of the whole truth, and except for flat and isolated contradictions, which seldom if ever occur in the great conversation, it is even possible that all the conflicting opinions may be false, just as it is possible for that opinion to be false on which all seem to agree. Some opinion, as yet unexpressed, at least not discoverable in the great books or in other books, may be the truth or nearer to it. In short, agreement and disagreement raise no more than a presumption of truth and falsity, a presumption which further inquiry can always challenge or rebut. This being the case, the introductions in their dialectical effort must fall short of answering the question which is the mind's fundamental concern. They would be dogmatic, not dialectical, if on any of the great issues they asserted or tried to prove the truth or falsity of any view. They would simply become one more voice in the perennial debate on fundamental issues. They refrain from doing this in order to do something else. The point is not that one more voice carries no weight in the forum of human discussion. The point is rather that a different type of contribution to the pursuit of truth can and should be made. Moreover, it is the only contribution the introductions can properly make as an integral part of a Syntopicon of the great books. These are not isolated essays published by an author in his own name. They are introductions to chapters on the great ideas in the great books. They introduce the outlines of topics. Together with the topics, they lead the reader to the references and prepare him to read, interpret, and judge what he finds in the books and passages they are referred to. The special contribution the introductions try to make to the debate or of perennial issues consists in being resolutely dialectical throughout. The special quality they try to achieve can be summarized in two words: dialectical objectivity. I'm going to be honest, my mind is not really focused in on this. But that's why I like to record myself reading, because I just go back and listen to it later. And then I try to pay attention again. I usually listen to everything I read at least once. Okay, so there's a sub point here. The words dialectical objectivity may be new, but the ideal they express is old. It has been the ideal of the encyclopedist, and the greatness of an encyclopedia can almost be measured by the closeness of its approximation to the ideal. In his prefatory notice to the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the editor T.S. Baines wrote that in the conflict of opinion, a work like the Encyclopedia is not called upon to take any direct part. It has to do with knowledge rather than opinion, and to deal with all subjects from a critical and historical rather than a dogmatic point of view. It cannot be the organ of any sect or party in science, religion, or philosophy. Its main duty is to give an accurate account of the facts and an impartial summary of results in every department of inquiry and research. In the prefatory material to the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, James Bryce quoted the foregoing paragraph from Baines and added, "The Encyclopedia Britannica itself has no side or party. It attempts to give representation to all parties, sects, and sides. Every effort has been made to obtain impartially such statements of doctrine and belief in matters of religion and similar questions as are satisfactory to those who hold them, and to deal with these questions so far as criticism is concerned in such a way that the controversial points may be understood and appreciated without prejudice to the argument. The easy way to what is sometimes considered impartiality is to leave controversy out altogether, and would be to avoid responsibility at the cost of perpetuating ignorance. For it is only in the light of the controversies about them that the importance of these questions of doctrine and opinion can be realized. Amid the variety of beliefs which are held with sincere conviction by one set of people or another, impartiality does not consist in concealing criticism or in withholding the knowledge of divergent opinion, but in an attitude of scientific respect which is precise in stating a belief in the terms and according to the interpretation accepted by those who hold it." And in another place, Bryce said, "He who writes a treatise often writes it to prove his own theory and disparage the theories of others, but in a work of reference such exclusiveness or partisanship would be reprehended, and is therefore usually avoided." Just remember to look up those bookshelf extenders. Oh. I don't know if I don't know if these are the bookshelves I remember seeing extenders for, but maybe. Reprehended. All right. These try to look at all sides and take no sides. Of course, they fail to achieve so exacting an ideal. They may succeed as the topics do in taking no sides. Just as the topics state subjects on which there can be different opinions, which affirming or denying any of the possible opinions, so the introductions try to present the issues without prejudice to any partisan point of view and treat conflicting positions impartially. But it is easier to take no sides than to look at all sides. In this latter respect, the introductions undoubtedly fail. To begin with, it is never possible to say that all possible sides of an important issue have been examined. They can never be exhaustively enumerated. The answers and arguments to be found in the great books are always weighty and significant, and are usually a fair sampling of the best human thought on the subject, but they never exhaust the possible possibilities of thought. Secondly, it is seldom possible for the introductions within the limits of a short essay to examine even all the answers and arguments in the great books, and even if some selection can be justified on the ground that it chooses the most significant opinions or the principal arguments, it still remains a selection. Finally, even those positions and arguments selected for examination and summary may not all be viewed with an equally open mind or presented in an equally favorable light. Perfect dialectical objectivity is not guaranteed by avoiding explicit judgments on the truth of conflicting opinions. Partiality can intrude itself in a variety of subtler ways, by the manner in which arguments are summarized, by shades of emphasis and neglect, by the tone of a question or the color of a passing remark, and by the order in which the various positions are presented. In order to avoid some of these faults, or at least to minimize their impairment of dialectical objectivity, the introductions resort to an obvious device and use it as much as possible. They report the opinion or argument of an author in his own language, substituting quotation for summary. Quotations may, of course, be wrenched out of context, and their sense may be falsified by the way in which they are quoted. But since each introductory essay is associated with references to the great books, citing fully all the passages from which the quotations are taken, and many more besides, which provide the rest of the context, the reader of the introductions is protected against such discrepancies as may occur. This device of quotation provides the introductions with a safeguard against the greater danger of lost my place. The greater danger of summarization. In addition, it gives them the flavor of the great conversation itself. It offers the reader a sample of the wealth of material cited in the references. Only the writer's firm intention to avoid them can be relied on to prevent other sorts of defection from dialectical objectivity. Dialectical objectivity demands a deliberate effort to balance question against question, to forego any comment that might be prejudicial, to check any tendency toward over or under emphasis. The reader can judge for himself the extent to which such effort has been successful in the writing of the introductions. On all these counts, the measure of dialectical objectivity achieved should be evident, but the reader cannot easily judge its achievement on the one remaining count, the order of discussion in the introductions. Mortimer Adler has a dizzying intellect. For example, many introductions end with the exposition of a particular author's theory of a controversial subject, and sometimes with a quotation unaccompanied by comment. I don't know that Mortimer Adler wrote this section, to be honest. It's going to be somebody else. Probably not, though. Although, maybe It says Robert Maynard Hutchins, editor-in-chief. It's a conglomeration of authors. Wait a minute. Is it about to tell me that I was certain that Mortimer Adler was the primary author? Now it's saying that Robert Maynard Hutchins. Mortimer Adler's the associate editor. And Robert Maynard Hutchins is the editor-in-chief. Well, it's about to tell me that the introductions were written by the editor-in-chief. Now I don't know if I want to read all that. I like Mortimer Adler. Huh. I have no idea where I was. I think I just turned the page. Only the writer's firm intention to avoid them can be relied on. Dialectical. The reader can judge for himself the extent to which such effort has been successful in the writing of the introductions. On all these accounts, the measure of dialectical objectivity achieved should be evident, but the reader cannot easily judge its achievement on the one remaining count, the order of discussion in the introductions. For example, many introductions end with the exposition of a particular author's theory of a controversial subject, and sometimes with a quotation unaccompanied by comment. Does this signify approval of the author's position on the question? In presenting a number of conflicting positions, the introductions must necessarily expound them in some order. Does the theory coming last in the series have the favored place, or does the first? The assumption behind these questions, which arise naturally enough, is that the writer of the introductions may have intellectual convictions which influence his ordering of the discussion, even though he does not allow himself to express them explicitly in the form of judgments about what is true or false. That assumption is partially correct. No mature mind can be without convictions, but they do not necessarily constitute an insuperable obstacle to maintaining the dialectical detachment sought for in the introductions. If the writer can refrain from expressing his own judgment about what is true and false, he can also, though perhaps with more difficulty, exercise sufficient caution to prevent his convictions from influencing the order in which he treats a variety of opinions, one of which he may hold as his own. He can do this by making certain that the views he himself favors do not uniformly occupy the same place in the order of discussion, whether that be first or last. A deliberate effort was made to avoid uniformity in the order of treatment. The result of this attempt cannot be judged by examining a single introduction, but by taking the 102 introductions as a whole. The reader can observe whether uniformity has been avoided. The reader's final judgment on the attainment of their dialectical aim can be made in terms of a test much more relevant than any examination of details, of methods, or order in the introductions. If a dialectical balance has been preserved, the reader should be left with the major questions to answer for himself. He should be left with the major issues unresolved, unless he has resolved them in his own mind. If he has any opinion as to where the truth lies, it should be his own, formed by him in the light of his reading, not preformed by him in any way. From the introductions themselves, he should derive only 3 types of opinion. 1, that for each of the great ideas, these are some of the questions or issues worth considering. 2, that for each of the questions or issues mentioned, these are some of the answers or solutions. And 3, that some of the questions are so connected that answering one of them in a certain way partly determines how others must be answered. If the introductions do more than this, they overstep their dialectical limits. For more than this would be to declare one answer true and another false. But if they do this much, neither more nor less, then they neither exceed their bounds nor fall short of their mark. And if, with respect to the 3 types of opinion they do try to assert, the introductions win the reader's acceptance, then they have for him as much dialectical truth as can be attained. It seems appropriate at this point to say a word about the writing of the introductions. They were written by the editor-in-chief of the great ideas. In a few cases, preliminary drafts of the essays were prepared by the general editor. Drafts of all the essays were read and criticized by the editor-in-chief of the great books of the Western world. Okay. So there is the editor-in-chief of the great drafts of all the essays were read and criticized by the editor-in-chief of the great books of the Western worlds, by editors on the staff of the Syntopical, and by other persons who generously accepted the task of reading and commenting on them. The suggestions for revision from all these sources were collated to guide the writing of a final draft. Okay, so we have the editor-in-chief of the great books of the Western world, and of the, quote, the great ideas. Robert M. Hutchins. Okay. The Great Books of the Western World. Robert Maynard Hutchins, Editor-in-Chief. Ah. Okay. We're good. We're good. The Great Ideas, a Syntopicon of the Great Books of the Western World. Mortimer J. Adler, Editor-in-Chief. So this man here, whose language I find baffling, he's the editor-in-chief of the Great Books of the Western World. So he's the guy. So he's talking about Mortimer Adler when he says they were written by the editor-in-chief of the Great Ideas. And they were all criticized by the editor-in-chief of the Great Books of the Western World, Maynard Hutchins, the guy whose writing I'm reading right now, I think. Unless Mortimer Adler wrote this, and it doesn't seem like Mortimer Adler wrote this. I feel like Mortimer Adler writes with a little more understandability. A little more lucidity. But maybe this is just, I don't know, confusing section. Who wrote all this? The following essay is intended as a supplement to the preface. The preface is the editor's statement of the nature, structure, purpose, and use of the Syntopicon. Okay. Well, let's finish up this section here. Drafts of all the essays were read and criticized by the editor-in-chief of the Great Books of the Western World, by editors of the staff of the Syntopicon, and by other persons who generously accepted the task of reading and commenting on them. The suggestions for revision from all these sources were collated to guide the writing of a final draft. In this, as in most collaborative efforts, the final responsibility for the accepting or rejecting suggestions rested with one person. The editor-in-chief of the Great Ideas assumed that final responsibility of authorship. To some degree, then, the introductions, as published, bear the authority of a group of minds working in collaboration, but they do not pretend to be that anomalous thing, a composite literary production. In their report of the traditional discussion of the great ideas, the introductions reflect their authors' reading of the great books. They also represent some knowledge of the books listed in the additional readings. It should not be necessary to say that no one, certainly no one responsible for the content of the introductions, has read all this literature. As for the great books, no one can claim to have read them all equally well, or to have read all of them systematically and carefully for their relevance to each of the 102 great ideas. That kind of reading was hardly feasible before the Syntopicon was constructed. The introductions were being written at the same time that the references to the great books were being compiled topic by topic, idea after idea. One fact about the writing of the introductions deserves repetition and emphasis. They were conceived as part of the Syntopicon and constructed in relation to the other parts, especially the outlines of topics and the references. According to this conception of their purpose, they were written not for scholars or specialists, but for the general reader, or more specifically, for future readers of the great books. This last point calls attention to one of the difficulties faced in writing the introductions. They could have and would have been written quite differently had they been intended for an audience of persons already familiar with the great books. Should such persons read the introductions, they may need to be reminded of this fact. Some readers may have devoted considerable time to the study of a particular author or group of authors, as measured by the depth of their own scholarship. The introductions may appear superficial or inadequate in the treatment of those authors. Other readers, as a result of their own scientific or philosophical work, may hold certain of the theories discussed in the introductions as measured by the complexity of their own speculative involvement. The introductions may appear to present imperfect or oversimplified versions of these doctrines. Such persons are asked to remember that the introductions try to give some account of all, not just a few, of the authors of the great books, and to present for each of the great ideas a dialectical treatment of conflicting opinions, not a scholarly exposition of particular doctrines considered in isolation. This they try to do in a manner suited to the layman, not the specialist. For future readers of the great books, not past masters of them. From the standpoint of the lay reader, the introductions may have defects of an opposite sort. The effort to make them intelligible to a person who has not read the great books, or certainly not studied them, involved a constant struggle against space limitations. It was often necessary to use certain technical words or phrases which have an established traditional meaning without being able to explain their significance in readily understandable terms. For example, for brevity of reference, it was often necessary to use such expressions as Kant's, quote, categorical imperative, Hegel's absolute idea, Spinoza's infinite modes, Freud's repression, Newton's evanescent quantity, or Ptolemy's epicycles. But it was not always possible at the point at which they were used to explain their meaning. When the introductions are obscure or cryptic for this reason, a remedy is available for the lay reader. The language of the introductions is keyed to that of the topics. The reader can, therefore, go to the topic which contains the difficult word or phrase. Under it, he will find references to the book in which that expression is amply explained by the author who made it part of his technical vocabulary. In some instances, the difficult expression does not appear in the language of the topics, but as used in the introductions. It may be associated with the name of a particular author. The remedy is still to go to the references, find the citations of that author's work, and look there for its meaning. The brevity of the introductions makes them dependent upon a reading of the great books under the guidance of the topics and references for the amplification of meanings. This is also true of many of the concepts and theories they deal with. Okay. What else is? Where was I? This is also true of many of the concepts and theories they deal with. Brevity of treatment, with or without quotations from authors, will leave the reader in need of fuller explanation. For the reader who is left perplexed by the introductions, the references provide a direct route to the better understanding he seeks. The brevity of the introductions even helps to fulfill the primary purpose of the Syntopical as a whole, which is to serve as a stimulus and a guide to reading the great books. Reading the introductions can never be a substitute for reading the books. The introductions were designed to create and leave unsatisfied an appetite for understanding. The quotations from the great book, which they contain, are always, as the volume of the references indicates, a small proportion of the quotable material. The topics with which they deal at any length are always a small proportion of the topics under the outline for each idea. The introductions are thus, at best, intimations of the great conversation. They are, in short, introductions, and in addition to all their other aims, they have a seductive aim which succeeds whenever the reader is prompted by perplexity, doubt, curiosity, or wonder to go from the introductions to the references and from them to the great books. Since the introductions usually employ the language of the topics, the reader is seldom left in doubt as to where he can find the additional material he seeks. There is one other deficiency in the introductions which result from their brevity, and it 2 has its remedy. The interconnection of the great ideas is such that sometimes the same points, the same problems, issues, concepts, or theories deserve treatment in the introductions to more than one chapter. Since the introductions appear in the alphabetical order of the ideas, each had to be written so that it could be read as an autonomous essay. This consideration made desirable the repetition of certain matters in 2 or more introductions, but the amount of repetition was sharply limited by the requirement of brevity. In consequence, certain matters highly relevant to the dialectic of a particular idea were reserved for treatment in the introductions to other ideas. Wherever this occurs, the introductions cite the other chapters in which these points are more amply treated. Thus, though any particular introduction may be obscure because it does not fully explain all the notions or doctrines to which it alludes, other introductions provide the reader with a remedy. As for the great ideas, so also for the introductions to the chapters on them, the alphabetical order conceals the intricate and highly significant pattern of the interdependence or co-implication. The order permits the reader to begin with any introduction or to read any one without first having to read others. But though the introductions were designed for such use, they were also written with an eye to the total pattern of the great ideas. It is part of their aim to take the reader wherever he starts and lead him from one idea to another along paths that, crisscrossing in all directions, cover the whole circle of ideas. All right. There you have it. I didn't really get much out of that, to be honest. I'm going to have to re-listen to it. I just feel like I want to know who wrote this, whether it was Maynard or Mortimer. Maynard or Mortimer, who wrote it? Probably says somewhere. The Great Ideas, Syntopical, Volume 2. This doesn't really matter that much. I can just start reading I'll probably not try to read one of these introductions today, but let's just say, for example, to get an idea of, let's open to a random idea. Boom. Slavery. Let's look at a different one. It's a little controversial. Mind. See if I can tell if this is any like easier to focus on while you're reading it. Chapter 58, Mind. In the tradition of the great books, the word mind is used less frequently than reason, intellect, understanding, or soul. There are still other words like intelligence, consciousness, and even spirit or psyche, which often carry some part of the connotation of the word mind. Certain authors use mind as a synonym for one or another of these words, and give it the meaning which other writers express exclusively in terms of reason or understanding. Some discuss mind without reference to soul, some identify mind with soul or spirit, and some conceive mind as only a part of soul or spirit. For the purpose of assembling in a single chapter references to all discussions which fall within the area of meaning common to all these terms, it was necessary to adopt some single covering word. Our choice of mind is partly the result of its present currency, partly the result of the fact that it is somewhat more neutral than the others, and therefore less prejudicial to the conflicting theories which are juxtaposed in this chapter. Words like reason or intellect usually imply a sharper distinction between the functions or faculties of sensation and thought than does the word mind. Imagination and memory, for example, are attributed to the understanding in the writings of Locke and Hume, whereas in the analytical vocabulary of Aristotle and Aquinas, imagination and memory belong to sense, not to reason or intellect. Similarly, words like soul or spirit usually connote a substantial as well as an immaterial mode of being, whereas mind can have the meaning of a faculty or a power to be found in living organisms. The adoption of the word mind is purely a matter of convenience. It begs no questions and decides no issues. The relations between what is here discussed and the matters considered in the chapters on soul, sense, memory, and imagination remain the same as they would be if reason or intellect were used in place of mind. Different formulations of these relationships are not affected by the words used, but by different theories of what the mind is, however it is named. All right, so maybe Mortimer wrote this Appendix 2, and I just haven't read any Mortimer Adler in a while. Of course, he wrote this in 1952, but he wrote this in 1940. 10 years earlier, 12 years earlier. And I've also just been reading a lot of Emerson lately, the past year and a half. That's what I mean by lately. And he probably was better at writing more clearly and understandably than Mortimer. Mortimer doesn't give a fuck if you aren't a genius like he is. But I guess that's probably true with all the great writers, but I feel like a great writer is probably great philosophers and stuff. We're more talented at expressing really complex ideas elegantly and clearly and understandably, poetically. But maybe Mortimer knows what he's doing when he's writing, and I would imagine. And that the fact that it's difficult to understand what he exactly is trying to say, and it doesn't really seem clearly like just feels like you're in a jungle of words whenever you're like that whole thing I just read. But maybe that's just how he gets you to think, gets you to pay attention. It seems like he has a very systematic way of writing. Like he's always enumerating points and stuff. Like firstly, secondly, thirdly. Like, not leaving out any detail that he finds important. Sort of like taking you on this journey of giving you every detail about what he thought was important. Which is cool. But it's difficult to keep up with them. All right. So I guess tomorrow, can't wait to see if they even process that order I placed for those 54 volumes from half off books or half price books, whatever it's called. Can't believe I found that. That's crazy. It saves me like $500. Assuming it's in very good condition, like they say. Guess we'll see. I don't know where it's shipping from. Nowhere near me because it was not available for pickup. Maybe I'll put them right here. These 3 shells. Makes sense. I'll find something to do with all these other books. Alright, so I guess tomorrow I will pick one of these. One or more, probably just one. One will probably be long enough. And read the introduction. Cross it off the list. And maybe I'll just not worry about getting through all of them in a timely manner, and maybe I'll do some syntopical research or something, because if I have all the books, I can do that and actually seriously study this stuff on the stream and read entire works and whatever the term was he used for reading a book cover to cover. And maybe at some point I'll Control Z. Yes. Maybe at some point I'll turn on the chat. See if anyone's saying anything. But you know, I'd like it to be like an education stream and not so much a just chatting stream. But if I end up getting people interested in, you know, like following me like just for the sake of philosophical study, if I end up getting any viewers, maybe I will turn on the chat and be able to have a more involved discussion with people real time about the philosophical ideas. But I don't think there's that many people too interested in education just for the sake of education. So needs to be a part of some degree they're getting. Like, that's the problem with our education system. They make you think that the only point to learning anything is so you can pass a test, and so you can get a good grade, and so you can get the certificate or something, so you can get a job, and then so you can fill your belly with bread, and not so you can actually live a better life. Which is what the great ideas are about. To bring life where there was none, and where it is already, to increase it. All right, that's it.